high on the rugged slopes of Eagle Peak, where pine trees whisper secrets and winter winds cut like knives, 12-year-old Mason huddled in his weathered cabin. Abandoned 3 years ago when his father walked into a blizzard and never returned, he survived with only his loyal German shepherd, Scout, for companionship. Then came the storm that shook the mountain and a deafening crash echoing through the valley below. Descending the treacherous path, Mason discovered the twisted metal carcass of a small aircraft nestled in a sheltered meadow near a spring. As he ran his fingers across the cold aluminum skin, something stirred in his lonely heart. Could this broken thing that fell from the sky become the home he'd been yearning for? Would this discovery change his solitary existence forever? And what secrets might be hidden within the wreckage that could explain why he was truly abandoned? Mason woke before dawn as he did every morning, the bitter mountain air biting at his exposed face as he slipped from beneath the pile of worn blankets on his makeshift bed. 3 years had passed since his father vanished into that terrible blizzard. 3 years of surviving alone on the unforgiving slopes of Eagle Peak, with only Scout, his loyal German shepherd, as companion and protector. The cabin creaked and groaned against the persistent wind as Mason kindled a small fire in the ancient stone hearth, his thin fingers working with practiced precision despite the cold. Scout pressed against his side, the dog's warm presence a constant comfort in a world that had abandoned them both. Their morning ritual never varied. A small portion of jerky from last month's deer, carefully rationed, water collected from the spring half a mile down the treacherous slope, carried back in battered metal buckets that had once been bright and new, and finally, the setting of snares along carefully memorized game trails. The boy had learned through bitter necessity, his 12 years weighing on him like 30 as he methodically checked and repaired the cabin's roof, reinforced its walls against the coming winter storms, and stretched their meager supplies with ingenuity born of desperation. Locals from the distant town below occasionally left supplies at the base of the mountain trail, but their pity was almost as hard to bear as their absence. Mason avoided their eyes on the rare occasions he ventured down, unable to withstand the mixture of sympathy and suspicion that followed him, the abandoned child who chose the mountain over the foster system. His father's hunting rifle, too heavy for his small frame when they first arrived, now felt natural in his calloused hands as he tracked rabbit and grouse through the underbrush, Scout padding silently beside him, their communication wordless and perfect. The cabin walls were decorated with the few photographs Mason had salvaged. His mother, gone since he was 4, her face beginning to blur in his memory despite his desperate attempts to hold on to her image. His father, tall and strong, laughing beside a mountain lake before the shadows had entered his eyes and the late-night phone calls had begun. Nights were the hardest, when the howling wilderness pressed in, and the silence between the wind gusts stretched into infinity. Mason would lie awake, Scout curled protectively at his feet, and stare at the ceiling his father had repaired, counting the knots in the wood and reciting the survival rules that had kept him alive. Sometimes he imagined conversations, asking his father why he had walked into that storm, why he hadn't said goodbye, why the mysterious men in dark vehicles had visited their remote cabin in the weeks before his disappearance. Other nights, he simply plotted the next day's tasks with military precision, which areas needed foraging, which cabin repairs couldn't wait. How many rounds of ammunition remained for hunting larger game? The boy's small library of battered books provided both education and escape, their pages read so many times he could recite entire chapters from memory. Mason's life had contracted to the rhythms of basic survival, a cycle of hunting, gathering, repairing, and enduring that left little room for childhood or dreams. Yet something of the boy remained beneath the weathered exterior, occasionally emerging when he and Scout raced through summer meadows or when he paused to watch eagles soaring above the valleys below, a moment of wonder piercing the practical shell he'd built around his heart. The thunderous crash echoed through the valleys of Eagle Peak like a cannon shot, sending birds scattering from the trees in panicked clouds as Mason bolted upright from where he had been repairing fishing line. Scout was already alert, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest as both boy and dog stared toward the eastern ridge, where a plume of dark smoke now rose against the clear morning sky. Mason hesitated only long enough to grab his father's hunting knife and a canteen before whistling to Scout, their curiosity overcoming caution as they navigated the treacherous descent toward the source of the disturbance. The German shepherd took point, following an invisible trail of scent and sound that led them through dense underbrush and across a narrow ravine, until they reached a small protected meadow nestled between two imposing rock faces. There, Partially obscured by shattered pine trees and gouged earth, lay the crumpled form of a small aircraft, its once sleek body now a twisted testament to gravity's unforgiving nature. Mason approached slowly, heart hammering in his chest, one hand clutching the knife while the other rested reassuringly on Scout's tense shoulders. The plane had carved a jagged scar across the meadow before coming to rest near a spring-fed pool, remarkably intact despite the violence of its landing. Steam still hissed from the engine compartment, mingling with the sharp smell of fuel and hot metal that made Scout sneeze and paw at his nose. Circling the wreckage at a cautious distance, Mason noted the shattered cockpit window and the way the door hung askew on bent hinges. Gathering his courage, he peered inside, bracing himself for gruesome sights, but found only an empty pilot's seat with straps unfastened and a dark stain on the cracked leather headrest. The absence of a body sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air, his eyes darting to the surrounding forest, as if expecting to find watching eyes among the trees. Scout's behavior confirmed his suspicions, the dog's nose working frantically over disturbed earth and broken branches that led away from the crash site before returning, suggesting someone had indeed been there and gone, perhaps carrying the injured pilot to safety, perhaps for darker purposes. Inside the cabin, Mason discovered scattered personal effects, a leather wallet containing identification for one Thomas Mercer, a half-empty pack of cigarettes, a tattered paperback novel with a bookmark still in place, and most intriguingly, a silver key on a chain that had slid beneath the co-pilot's seat. The disarray spoke of hasty removal rather than careful rescue, and in the carpet beneath the main console, Mason noticed rectangular impressions where something had been recently removed. Scout growled suddenly, hackles rising as he stared intently at the tree line, causing Mason to drop into a defensive crouch beside the plane's wheel well. Minutes passed in tense silence before the dog relaxed, whatever had triggered his alarm apparently gone. As his initial fear subsided into wary curiosity, Mason began to see beyond the wreckage to possibility, his resourceful mind already cataloging useful parts. Unbroken windows that could replace the cabin's cracked panes, relatively intact aluminum sheeting that might reinforce his leaking roof, seats whose stuffing could provide better bedding than his current arrangements. He ran his hand along the plane's damaged side, feeling the smooth metal warm beneath his touch, already imagining how this disaster might become salvation for a boy who had learned to transform abandonment into opportunity. Dawn broke over Eagle Peak, painting the crash site in hues of gold and amber as Mason returned with a determined set to his jaw and a makeshift sled fashioned from pine branches, loaded with blankets, tools, and supplies from the cabin. After a restless night filled with dreams of metal birds and new beginnings, he had risen before first light, driven by a vision that would not release its grip on his imagination. Working methodically, he began clearing the debris field around the aircraft, sorting salvageable items into careful piles, unbroken glass, usable metal sheets, wiring that might serve some purpose, and smaller treasures like undamaged instruments from the cockpit. The plane's fuselage had remained remarkably intact despite the violence of its landing, its aluminum skin dented but largely unbroken, the passenger cabin a protected shell that seemed to welcome him each time he ducked through the crooked doorway. Scout patrolled the perimeter, occasionally bringing Mason small items that had been flung far from the crash. A compass, a metal thermos still sealed and containing lukewarm coffee, a pilot's logbook with water-stained pages. As morning stretched into afternoon, Mason worked without pause, his small body moving with the efficiency of one accustomed to labor, sweeping broken glass from the floor, removing shattered seats to create open space, and wiping away the thin film of dust and fuel that coated every surface. The boy spread his blankets across the rear section of the cabin where the floor remained level, creating a sleeping area that felt more secure than his drafty cabin had in years. He arranged his basic tools along the intact portion of the instrument panel, a hammer, rusty screwdrivers, wire cutters salvaged from his father's toolbox, and a pocket knife with a blade worn thin from constant sharpening. Scout's excited barking drew Mason from the plane, the dog bounding through undergrowth before disappearing behind a rock formation 50 yards from the crash site. Following his companion with curious steps, Mason pushed through a narrow gap in the stones to discover a hidden grotto fed by a clear stream that bubbled from the mountainside, forming a small but deep pool before continuing downslope, the water so crystal clear he could count the pebbles lining its bed. The secluded location, sheltered by rock walls and dense foliage that had somehow escaped damage during the plane's descent, offered protection from harsh mountain winds and prying eyes alike. Returning to the crash site, Mason stood back, surveying his progress with critical eyes that saw both what was and what could be, windows needing cleaning but intact, a door that could be repaired to close properly, interior space sufficient for a young boy and his dog, and now a hidden water source just steps away. The afternoon sun glinted off the plane's metal surface as Mason ran his hand along its side, no longer seeing a wreck but the framework of a home more solid than his deteriorating cabin, more protected than his exposed existence had been since his father's disappearance. He whispered quiet promises to the twisted metal and shattered glass, vowing to transform destruction into sanctuary, to create from this fallen sky creature a haven where abandonment could not follow. Scout pressed against his leg, sensing the shift in his young master's mood from mere survival to something approaching hope, the dog's loyalty unwavering as Mason squared his thin shoulders and climbed back into the cabin, already measuring spaces with his eyes and planning improvements with a craftsman's precision despite his youth. The fourth day of Mason's transformation project began with a methodical inspection of the plane's interior, his small fingers tracing every seam and panel for potential weaknesses or hidden treasures. Scout lounged in a patch of sunlight streaming through the cockpit window, occasionally sniffing at unfamiliar scents that still lingered despite Mason's cleaning efforts. When the boy's weight shifted against a section of damaged flooring near the rear of the cabin, a metallic groan prompted further investigation. Prying up the buckled aluminum revealed a compartment cleverly built into the plane's structure, and nestled within it, a brushed metal case approximately the size of his father's old toolbox, secured with a sophisticated lock unlike anything in Mason's limited experience. The case refused to yield to his tentative manipulations, its weight suggesting contents of significance, the unmarked exterior offering no clues about what treasures or dangers might wait inside. Setting it aside with reluctant patience, Mason continued his exploration, removing a loose panel beneath the co-pilot's seat that concealed a small leather pouch containing several folded documents and, most startling of all, a torn photograph whose edges suggested hasty ripping rather than accidental damage. The image showed the very aircraft Mason now claimed as his own, still pristine and gleaming on an airfield he didn't recognize. And standing beside it, with one hand resting proprietarily on the wing, was a man whose profile, even partially visible in the torn picture, sent a shock of recognition through Mason's small frame. Though the face was partially obscured and years younger than in Mason's memories, the stance, the particular angle of the shoulders, the way the hand splayed against the metal surface all screamed familiarity that could not be coincidence. His father, who had claimed to be nothing more than a forest researcher, stood documented beside the very plane that had crashed into their mountain home 3 years after his disappearance. Mason's hands trembled as he studied the photograph in the shifting light, Scout abandoning his sunny spot to press reassuringly against the boy's side, sensing the emotional storm brewing within his young master. Questions multiplied faster than answers as Mason carefully examined the remaining contents of the pouch. Flight logs with coordinates hastily scribbled in margins, maintenance records signed with initials that matched his father's, fuel calculations for mountain routes that would have passed directly over Eagle Peak. The metal case took on new significance as Mason returned to it, running his fingers over the lock mechanism with reverent uncertainty. Suddenly afraid of what secrets it might contain about the man who had walked into a blizzard and never returned, the man who had perhaps been something other than what he had claimed. Night fell as Mason sat cross-legged on his blanket nest, the photograph propped against the locked case before him, his father's ghost seeming to step from the torn paper and fill the confined space of the aircraft cabin with unspoken explanations. Scout whined softly, licking Mason's hand as if to remind him that revelations could wait until morning, that the plane would guard its secrets through the night, that the orphaned boy needed rest before confronting the possibility that abandonment might have been something more complicated than the simple desertion he had believed for 3 lonely years. The sound of snapping twigs shattered the morning stillness, causing Mason to bolt upright from where he had been attempting to pry open the mysterious case with improvised tools. Scout was already at attention, a low growl building in his throat as he positioned himself protectively between Mason and the aircraft door. A shadow fell across the threshold, resolving into the broad-shouldered silhouette of a man whose weathered face and wild gray beard suggested years spent under open skies. Mason scrambled backward, reaching for his knife as Scout's growl intensified. But the stranger made no move to enter, instead remaining perfectly still with his hands visible at his sides. "That dog has good instincts, just like his master," the man said in a voice rough as pine bark, eyes traveling slowly over the transformation Mason had begun. "Been watching you work for 2 days now, wondering if you were scavenger or survivor." Mason kept his silence, evaluating the intruder with wary calculation, noting the well-worn but quality gear, the knife and small axe hanging from a leather belt, the quiet competence in his stillness. "Name's Henry," the man continued, slowly crouching to reduce his imposing height. "Some folks down in the valley call me Old Henry, though I ain't as old as all that." He gestured toward the metal case that had resisted Mason's efforts. "Saw that case when I checked the crash site before you found it. Figured whoever came looking next might have the key." The casual mention of prior knowledge triggered Mason's suspicion, his grip tightening on the knife as Scout's hackles raised further. Henry's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly as he reached slowly into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that had clearly been carried for some time, its creases deep and permanent. "Your daddy gave me this, said if anything happened to him, I should check on his boy." The paper, when cautiously accepted and unfolded by Mason's trembling fingers, contained a hand-drawn map of Eagle Peak with the location of their cabin precisely marked, alongside a message in his father's unmistakable handwriting. "The boy's name is Mason. He trusts his dog's judgment." Scout had fallen silent, his initial growl fading to curious inspection as he cautiously approached Henry, sniffing with professional thoroughness before giving a single tail wag that melted something in Mason's defensive posture. "You knew my father," Mason stated rather than asked, years of isolation making his voice sound strange to his own ears. Henry nodded slowly, his gaze moving to the torn photograph Mason had propped against the plane's wall. "Knew him better than most, worked with him too. Though that's a longer story than morning allows." With deliberate movements that honored Mason's continued caution, Henry surveyed the plane conversion efforts, occasionally nodding with approval. "You've got good instincts for structure, but that door needs proper sealing before winter winds hit, and you'll need better insulation than blankets." He gestured toward the mountain above them. "Got a cabin myself, not 3 miles from here. Got tools, materials, knowledge that might help turn this wreck into something that could see you through winter." The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken history and potential. Mason studied the man who claimed connection to his vanished father, measuring the stranger against his isolation, his questions, and his need for assistance that his pride had never before allowed him to acknowledge. Scout had already made his decision, sitting comfortably beside Henry as if they were old acquaintances, the dog's judgment proving as reliable as his father's note had suggested. The following weeks established a rhythm between the unlikely pair, as Henry arrived each morning with tools slung across his broad back and knowledge to share with the boy who had survived alone for too long. "You've been making do, but now you'll learn to thrive," he told Mason, as they carefully removed the aircraft's damaged door and rebuilt it with salvaged aluminum and a rubber gasket Henry produced from his seemingly bottomless pack. Mason absorbed each lesson with the intensity of a child starved for guidance, his quick mind grasping concepts beyond his years as Henry taught him to create silicon seals from natural materials, to layer insulation between interior panels, to fashion a chimney vent that would allow safe heating without smoke damage. "Your snares are clever but inefficient," Henry observed one afternoon, demonstrating how slight adjustments to placement and tension would yield better results with less effort. When Mason asked where he had learned such skills, Henry's eyes grew distant before he replied with careful neutrality, "Same place your father did, during times best not remembered." Scout adopted Henry immediately, following the mountain man with the same devotion he showed Mason, occasionally disappearing with him into the forest and returning with game larger than Mason could have managed alone. The aircraft gradually transformed under their combined efforts, its broken shell becoming a fortress against mountain elements, with reinforced windows, insulated walls, a small wood stove installed where passenger seats had once been, and clever storage solutions built into every available space. During their work, Mason repeatedly attempted to steer conversations toward his father, only to find Henry redirecting with tactical precision. "These support beams need diagonal bracing like this," he would say when Mason asked about his father's research, or "weather patterns suggest early snow this year," when questioned about how they had met. The only information offered came in fragmented warnings that raised more questions than answers. Your father understood what these mountains hide, Henry said one evening as they secured the perimeter with nearly invisible tripwires that would alert them to unwelcome visitors. Corporations see resources where we see sanctuary, and they don't take kindly to those who stand between them and profit. When Mason pressed for clarification, Henry merely pointed to distant scars on the mountainside, visible only to experienced eyes, places where test drilling had pierced the forest canopy. There are men who would think nothing of harm to a boy if it served their purpose, he added, checking that Mason understood how to use the signaling system they had established between the plane and Henry's cabin. The locked case remained between them, unmentioned but omnipresent, as if both silently agreed its time had not yet come. Mason noticed how Henry's eyes occasionally drifted to it during their work, how his weathered hand sometimes reached toward his shirt pocket where something key-shaped created a slight bulge, only to move elsewhere with deliberate casualness. At night, after Henry departed for his own cabin with promises to return at dawn, Mason would sit with Scout beside their small fire, reviewing the day's lessons while adding each hint and evasion to the growing puzzle of his father's true work on the mountain and the events that had led to his disappearance. The plane that had once represented only shelter now symbolized connection, both to his father's hidden past and to a future less defined by isolation. As Mason's thin shoulders straightened with each new skill mastered, and each small revelation gleaned from his reluctant mentor, the discovery happened by accident while Mason was reinforcing the aircraft's damaged floor panels, his hammer striking a section that returned a hollow sound distinctly different from the surrounding areas. Scout, who had been dozing nearby, perked up at Mason's sudden stillness, watching intently as the boy carefully pried up what appeared to be normal flooring, to reveal a compartment so seamlessly integrated into the aircraft's design that it would have remained invisible without the crash damage that had subtly misaligned its edges. Unlike the crude storage space that had held the metal case, this hidden section featured a sophisticated locking mechanism that had partially broken during impact, allowing Mason to slide it open with careful manipulation. Inside, protected by waterproof material, lay several manila envelopes sealed with red tape and bearing official government markings that Mason recognized from his limited schooling, along with stamps declaring classified in bold red letters. The boy's heart raced as he gingerly removed one envelope, its weight suggesting multiple documents within, the paper cool and official beneath his calloused fingers. Scout whined softly, sensing his master's excitement as Mason carefully broke the seal, revealing the first page of what appeared to be a detailed report filled with technical language beyond his comprehension, though certain phrases leapt out: environmental impact assessment, contamination levels, unauthorized extraction activities, and most intriguing of all, whistleblower testimony. Several pages contained maps of Eagle Peak and the surrounding mountain range marked with symbols and coordinates, while others featured columns of numbers and chemical formulas alongside photographs of water samples and damaged vegetation. Mason had barely begun processing these findings when Henry's shadow fell across the cabin entrance, his daily arrival perfectly coinciding with this momentous discovery. The mountain man froze upon seeing the opened envelopes and exposed documents, his weathered face draining of color so rapidly that Mason instinctively recoiled, fearing anger or betrayal. "You shouldn't have opened those," Henry said, his voice unnaturally tight as his eyes darted from the papers to the surrounding forest, as if expecting immediate consequences, with movements that betrayed uncharacteristic anxiety. Henry quickly crossed the small space and began carefully returning the documents to their envelopes, his hands betraying a slight tremor that Mason had never before witnessed in his unflappable mentor. "These papers are dangerous, boy. More dangerous than bears or winter storms or anything these mountains have taught you to fear," he continued, securing the compartment with practiced motions that suggested familiarity with its design. "There are men who would kill without hesitation if they knew these were here. Men with resources and reach beyond your understanding." Mason's protest died unspoken as he registered the genuine fear beneath Henry's gruff exterior, a vulnerability that transformed his curiosity into caution. "Your father protected you by keeping you separate from his work," Henry added more gently, resting a reassuring hand briefly on Mason's shoulder. "These documents need to stay hidden until the right time comes, until proper authorities can receive them through proper channels." The mention of proper authorities sparked questions Mason couldn't suppress, but Henry merely shook his head, his expression communicating clear warning. "Knowledge is like fire, Mason, necessary for survival, but deadly when uncontained. For now, we focus on making this place secure and undetectable. That night, after Henry departed with unusual haste, Mason lay awake beside Scout, the reality of his situation expanding beyond simple abandonment into something more complex and potentially sinister. The aircraft no longer merely shelter but a vessel containing secrets that powerful people might kill to possess or suppress. Scout's agitated barking jolted Mason from sleep before dawn, the German shepherd standing rigid at the aircraft door, his hackles raised and ears forward in a posture that instantly banished any remnants of drowsiness from the boy's mind. Following his faithful companion through the early morning mist that clung to the mountain slopes, Mason crept to the edge of a ridge overlooking the valley below, his breath catching at the sight that greeted him. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows had parked at the logging road that marked the base of Eagle Peak, disgorging men in dark clothing who moved with military precision as they unloaded equipment that gleamed ominously in the first rays of sunlight. A hand suddenly clamped over Mason's mouth, stifling his startled cry until he recognized Henry's weathered face beside him. The mountain man's finger pressed to his lips in a silent command for absolute quiet. Together they watched as the strangers assembled what appeared to be sophisticated detection devices, their hushed voices occasionally carrying on the wind with fragments of conversation about crash coordinates and recovery operation that sent cold tendrils of dread through Mason's small body. Henry pulled Mason back from the ridgeline, his expression grave as they retreated to the relative safety of the dense forest, Scout padding silently behind them with occasional backward glances. "They've come sooner than I expected," Henry whispered once they were safely distant, his normally calm demeanor replaced by tightly controlled urgency. "Those aren't search and rescue, those are corporate recovery specialists. And what they're recovering isn't people." Back at the aircraft, Henry began working with unprecedented haste, showing Mason how to gather pine boughs and arrange them over the plane's exposed surfaces, creating natural camouflage that would render it nearly invisible from both ground and air. "We have days, not weeks now," Henry explained as they worked, his hands never stopping as he installed the final components of their early warning system. "We need to finish weatherproofing tonight, and tomorrow we'll disguise the smoke from your stove, create false trails leading away from here, and establish multiple escape routes." As Mason secured the hidden compartment containing the government documents, double-checking that no trace of their discovery remained, Henry finally addressed the question burning in the boy's eyes. "Those men work for Apex Mining Corporation, the company your father was investigating before he disappeared. They believe all evidence of their environmental crimes died with the pilot of this aircraft, and they've come to ensure nothing remains that might expose them." The revelation landed like a physical blow, connecting previously separate puzzle pieces into a pattern that implicated his father in matters far beyond forest research. When Mason asked if they should simply flee deeper into the mountains, Henry shook his head with grim determination. "Running means abandoning the evidence that could bring justice, not just for your father but for these mountains and everyone who depends on their unspoiled water and air. We stay, we hide, we prepare." That night, as they worked by moonlight to complete the plane's transformation from wreckage to invisible fortress, Mason felt something shift within his chest, his fear gradually giving way to a resolve that straightened his spine and steadied his hands. Whatever his father had been involved in, whatever danger now approached their mountain sanctuary, Mason would face it with the same resilience that had kept him alive for 3 lonely years. Bolstered now by Henry's guidance and the growing certainty that his father's disappearance had been an act of protection rather than abandonment. The crackling fire inside the now camouflaged aircraft cast long shadows across Henry's face as he finally yielded to Mason's persistent questions, the mountain man's shoulders sagging with the weight of secrets long carried alone. "This plane wasn't just any aircraft," he began, his voice low and measured as Scout settled vigilantly by the door, alert to any approaching danger. "It was part of a covert Environmental Protection Agency operation, transporting evidence gathered over 3 years about Apex Mining's illegal operations throughout protected wilderness areas in these mountains." Henry traced his finger across a map he pulled from his pocket, indicating a network of locations spanning 3 states where corporation-funded drilling had poisoned water tables, destroyed critical wildlife habitats, and violated dozens of federal regulations while local officials looked the other way, their silence purchased with generous donations and lucrative job offers. "Your father was more than a researcher," Henry continued, each word carefully chosen as if testing thin ice. He was the lead whistleblower, the one who first documented the contaminated streams that were killing livestock and making children sick in valley communities. The one who collected soil samples showing heavy metal concentrations that exceeded legal limits by factors of hundreds. Mason listened with growing understanding as Henry explained how the pilot, Thomas Mercer, had been a trusted government courier tasked with transporting the complete investigation file to federal prosecutors in Denver. A file containing not just scientific evidence but financial records, revealing bribes to officials and falsified environmental impact statements that would have resulted in criminal charges against Apex executives and fines potentially exceeding hundreds of millions of dollars. Information that dangerous creates its own gravity, Henry said, poking the fire as his eyes reflected its flames. Apex would have lost their mining permits across North America, faced shareholder lawsuits, watched their stock collapse, and seen their executives serve prison time. The content of that metal case and those hidden compartments represents billions in potential losses to people who view money as the only meaningful metric of success. The revelation of his father's true role transformed Mason's understanding of the past 3 years, each memory recontextualized by this new knowledge. The men in suits who visited our cabin, Mason whispered, recalling the tense conversations behind closed doors, his father's increasingly furtive behavior in those final weeks. Henry nodded grimly, confirming the connection. Your father knew they were closing in, knew they had identified him as the primary source. His disappearance wasn't abandonment, Mason. It was a calculated attempt to draw their attention away from you, to make them believe he had taken the evidence with him. A heavy silence filled the aircraft cabin as Mason absorbed this truth, grief and pride warring in his expression. Then why did he never come back? Why let me believe I was alone all this time? Henry's weathered face softened with compassion as he reached into his shirt and removed a worn leather cord from around his neck, revealing a small key that glinted in the firelight. Because Apex never stopped watching this mountain, never stopped monitoring everyone connected to your father. Coming back would have confirmed your importance and made you a target. He placed the key in Mason's palm, closing the boy's fingers around it with gentle pressure. This opens the case your father entrusted to me before he disappeared, the final piece of evidence that would complete the investigation. He made me promise not to give it to you until you were either old enough to understand its significance or until circumstances forced our hand. The key felt impossibly heavy in Mason's small hand, its metal warm from years spent against Henry's skin, its presence transforming the aircraft from mere shelter to the center of a conflict far larger than one abandoned boy's survival. The morning stillness shattered with Scout's warning growl, the dog's ears flattening against his skull as he nudged Mason urgently from where they had been collecting kindling near the disguised aircraft. Following his faithful companion to the ridge, overlooking their sanctuary, Mason's blood froze at the sight below. 4 men in tactical gear, methodically working their way up the mountain slope, their movements purposeful and practiced as they consulted handheld devices and occasionally marked locations on a digital map. The corporate searchers had advanced much farther than Henry had anticipated, already less than a mile from the crash site, their specialized equipment occasionally emitting electronic chirps that carried through the clear mountain air. Mason retreated silently, gathering only essential supplies before whistling softly for Scout to follow him away from their compromised position, remembering Henry's instructions for precisely this scenario. Moving with the careful deliberation of prey, avoiding predators, the boy and his dog navigated a circuitous route through dense underbrush toward a rock formation. Henry had shown them 3 days prior, their progress slow but invisible to the advancing search party. When booted footsteps suddenly sounded much closer than expected, Mason froze in momentary panic before Scout nudged him toward a fallen log, both boy and dog sliding beneath its massive trunk, just as 2 searchers crested the nearby ridge. Signals strongest along this drainage basin. One man reported into a radio, close enough that Mason could see the sweat stains on his dark uniform and, most alarmingly, the distinctive triangular logo embroidered on his sleeve. A stylized mountain peak inside a circle that matched exactly the corporate emblem stamped across the documents in the plane's hidden compartment. The second searcher consulted a tablet displaying topographical maps overlaid with grid patterns, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. Debris field calculations suggest primary impact within half-mile radius of current position. Team 2 reports metal fragments consistent with aircraft aluminum, approximately 400 meters northeast. Scout's body trembled against Mason's side, the dog's training warring with protective instincts as the searchers passed within 20 feet of their hiding place, close enough that the boy could smell tobacco and coffee on their breath, could see the holstered weapons strapped to their thighs. When the men finally moved beyond visual range, Mason released his held breath and resumed the careful journey toward the sanctuary Henry had prepared, navigating by landmarks memorized during their training. The lightning struck pine, the boulder shaped like a sleeping bear, the cliff face with exposed quartz that sparkled even in dim light. The cave entrance appeared suddenly, concealed behind a natural curtain of hanging vines and so narrow that Mason had to turn sideways to slip through, Scout squeezing after him into the cool darkness beyond. Inside, the passage widened into a system of interconnected chambers that Henry had stocked with emergency supplies, the mountain man's foresight now their salvation as Mason located the promised lantern and waterproof matches. The dancing flame revealed smooth stone walls flowing with condensation, a small underground stream providing fresh water, and multiple exits that Henry had carefully explained would allow them to circle behind pursuers if necessary. Huddled against the damp stone with Scout pressed protectively against him, Mason tried to still his racing heart while processing how closely they had come to discovery, how easily their fragile sanctuary might have been compromised, and most disturbingly, how the corporate logo on the searchers' equipment confirmed everything Henry had revealed about Apex Mining's determination to recover evidence that could destroy their company. The cave's protected silence amplified each distant sound from outside, forcing Mason to distinguish between natural forest movements and the methodical progression of men who would think nothing of harming a child who stood between them and billions of dollars in corporate interests. The searchers eventually departed as darkness fell, allowing Mason and Henry to return to the concealed aircraft under cover of night, Scout leading the way through forest paths invisible to untrained eyes. Exhausted but unable to rest, Mason confronted Henry with the quiet intensity that had replaced childish impatience during their weeks together, demanding truths no longer deniable after their narrow escape. Henry stared into their small fire for long moments, his weathered face carved with shadows that seemed to age him decades before he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filling the aircraft cabin with revelations long overdue. Your father and I met 15 years ago in the EPA's Special Investigations Unit, a department so classified most government officials don't know it exists. Tasked with gathering evidence against corporations whose environmental crimes were too sophisticated for normal regulatory channels to detect or prosecute. We specialized in wilderness operations, living off-grid for months while documenting illegal activities in protected areas, building cases methodically until the evidence became irrefutable. Henry removed a small leather wallet from his inner pocket, extracting a faded photograph showing two younger men in hiking gear standing before pristine mountain lakes. Mason's father, smiling with an ease the boy barely remembered, his arm thrown casually around Henry's shoulders. We collected water samples from streams running thick with mining runoff, installed hidden cameras documenting midnight dumping operations, infiltrated company meetings disguised as maintenance workers, and recorded executives casually discussing how many deaths from contaminated water supplies represented an acceptable business expense compared to proper waste disposal costs. The mountain man's fingers trembled slightly as he traced his former partner's face in the photograph, continuing with increased urgency. When Apex Mining realized someone was building a case against them, they hired former military contractors to identify the leak. Focusing quickly on our team, after intercepting communications between your father and federal prosecutors. 2 of our colleagues died in supposed accidents within weeks. Another disappeared completely, leaving just your father and me to complete the investigation that would have stopped their operations permanently. Scout pressed against Mason's side, sensing the emotional storm building within his young master as Henry finally addressed the question that had haunted the boy for 3 lonely years. Your father received death threats targeting not just him but specifically you. Messages with surveillance photos of you at the cabin, at the stream, sleeping through your bedroom window, demonstrating how easily they could reach you at any moment. He realized the only way to protect you was to disappear completely, drawing their attention and resources toward tracking him rather than monitoring a seemingly abandoned child too young to possess damaging evidence or understand its significance. Tears tracked silently down Mason's face as years of perceived abandonment transformed into understanding of his father's desperate sacrifice, each memory of hardship and loneliness recontextualized by this new knowledge. He left planning to return within months, Once federal protection could be arranged for both of you, but something went wrong. Communications ceased. And I've been searching for him ever since while monitoring you from a distance, waiting for the right moment to fulfill my promise to help you understand and continue his work. Henry reached across the small space separating them, his calloused hand gripping Mason's shoulder with gentle pressure. Your father loved you enough to let you believe the worst of him if it meant keeping you alive, knowing someday you might understand his choice was never between you and his work, but between temporary separation and your certain death. Sleep eluded Mason that night, his mind racing with revelations about his father's true work and noble intentions, leaving him restless despite physical exhaustion from their narrow escape. As false dawn painted the eastern sky with hesitant light, the boy found himself meticulously re-examining the aircraft interior, searching for anything they might have overlooked during their hasty fortification efforts. Removing a loose panel beneath the navigator's station that had always felt slightly different from surrounding sections, Mason discovered yet another concealed compartment, this one smaller and more personally crafted than the sophisticated government installations, its edges bearing tool marks suggesting hasty modification. Nestled within lay a weathered leather journal bound with a simple cord, its pages swollen slightly from mountain humidity but otherwise intact, the handwriting instantly recognizable as belonging to the man whose absence had defined Mason's life for 3 painful years. Scout pressed against his side, offering silent support as Mason's fingers trembled opening the cover to reveal his father's precise script, filling page after page with observations, coordinates, and increasingly urgent warnings. Apex Mining CEO confirmed bribing Forest Service officials to falsify environmental impact reports, one entry read, followed by detailed accounts of mercury levels in downstream communities showing elevated rates of neurological disorders in children, alongside photographs of mining waste seeping into pristine watersheds. The journal documented escalating stakes and dangers, tracking how evidence gathering had evolved from conventional channels to increasingly covert operations. Standard reporting procedures compromised, his father wrote in increasingly agitated handwriting. Regional EPA director revealed as recipient of Apex consulting fees through shell companies. Federal communications monitored. Must establish alternate transport methods for physical evidence. Subsequent entries detailed the creation of a network of trusted pilots flying small private aircraft to transport evidence dockets directly to specific federal prosecutors known to resist corporate influence, the very system that had brought the crashed plane to Eagle Peak. Most disturbing were the final entries, dated just days before his father's disappearance. Received photographs of Mason sleeping in his bedroom, school bus stop, fishing at our stream. Message clear. They will target him if I continue. Henry agrees extraction necessary. Will create diversion by appearing to flee with evidence, drawing surveillance away from the cabin while Henry establishes monitoring. When safe, federal marshals will extract Mason to protective custody. God forgive me for leaving him even temporarily, but better he hate me for apparent abandonment than die because of my work. The journal's final pages contain detailed contingency plans, including the creation of hidden compartments in transport planes, emergency contact protocols, and most critically, the coordinates of multiple evidence caches scattered throughout the mountain range, insurance against the possibility of primary evidence being compromised or destroyed. Clutching the journal to his chest, Mason felt simultaneous grief and vindication wash over him in powerful waves. His father's actual thoughts and intentions now tangible proof that the abandonment he had experienced had been an illusion concealing desperate parental protection. Through tear-blurred vision, he studied the transport plans detailed in the final sections, recognizing route patterns that would have taken aircraft directly over their cabin at regular intervals. A system designed to allow periodic monitoring of the boy's welfare without risking direct contact that would endanger him. The journal represented not just evidence of corporate crimes, but something infinitely more precious to a boy who had believed himself forgotten. Proof that every moment of his father's absence had been filled with anguished concern for the son he had left behind. Dawn revealed columns of smoke rising from the valley below, drawing Mason and Henry to their observation point where binoculars exposed the disturbing scale of Apex Mining Corporation's commitment to recovering their secrets. What had begun as a small search party had transformed overnight into a substantial operation, with large canvas tents forming a command center, satellite communication equipment glinting in the morning sun, and at least 20 personnel moving with military precision around all-terrain vehicles loaded with sophisticated detection gear. Henry's face darkened as he identified specific individuals through the binoculars before passing them to Mason, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The man in the gray suit is Charles Whitfield, Apex's head of security and former Special Forces commander, responsible for coordinating their black operations against environmental activists. Beside him is Patricia Mercer, their chief legal counsel and crisis manager, only deployed when billions in corporate interests are at stake. Mason studied these distant figures who represented an existential threat, ordinary in appearance yet wielding resources and influence capable of crushing a boy and his dog without hesitation or remorse. While Scout kept watch, Henry led Mason on a circuitous route to an overlooking ridge where they could eavesdrop on the base camp's communications, the mountain man producing a small radio receiver tuned to frequencies mentioned in Mason's father's journal. Through bursts of static and technical jargon emerged crucial intelligence. The corporation had traced the plane's final coordinates, believed it contained comprehensive evidence of their environmental crimes across 7 states, and operated under the assumption that both pilot and documentation had perished in the crash. Primary objective remains recovery of all onboard storage devices and physical evidence dockets. Whitfield's voice crackled through the receiver, his tone suggesting absolute authority. Satellite imagery indicates probable crash site within this 5-square-mile sector, though debris dispersal patterns suggest significant fragmentation upon impact. Geological survey teams will establish perimeter operations to prevent accidental discovery by hikers or forestry personnel. As Mason and Henry retreated to their hidden sanctuary, the mountain man outlined the full stakes with unflinching clarity. What you possess would trigger the largest environmental prosecution in American history, with potential penalties exceeding $4 billion and mandatory prison terms for at least 12 executives currently walking free. The documentation details not just illegal mining operations but deliberate contamination of evidence, witness intimidation, and conspiracy charges that would dismantle Apex's entire North American operation. That evening, watching the distant pinpricks of the corporate base camp's lights from the aircraft's concealed position, Mason felt the weight of responsibility settling across his thin shoulders. The metal case, hidden compartment documents, and his father's journal now represented not just personal vindication but potential justice for communities poisoned by corporate greed, for ecosystems deliberately destroyed for quarterly profits, for colleagues who had died pursuing truth, and for a father forced to abandon his son to protect him from powerful men who viewed human lives as acceptable collateral damage in service to shareholder value. Scout pressed reassuringly against Mason's leg, the German shepherd's steadfast loyalty, a counterpoint to the corporate forces gathering below, as Henry quietly reinforced their defensive measures, both man and boy understanding that Apex's confidence in the evidence's destruction represented their only advantage in this dangerously uneven confrontation between a child's determination and a corporation's limitless resources. Racing against the expanding corporate presence below, Mason and Henry worked through day and night to complete their aircraft transformation, their shared purpose forging a partnership that transcended the difference in their ages and experiences. The plane's exterior now disappeared completely into the mountainside, with living vegetation growing from soil-filled containers attached to the aluminum skin, fallen logs strategically positioned to break up the aircraft's silhouette, and a sophisticated rainwater collection system that channeled mountain precipitation from the wings into storage containers hidden beneath the fuselage. Inside, the transformation was even more remarkable, with Henry's expertise and Mason's ingenuity combining to create a space that balanced security with unexpected beauty and comfort. Salvaged solar panels, carefully positioned to catch dappled sunlight without revealing reflective surfaces to aerial observation, connected to a battery system that powered essential lighting and the communication equipment Henry had smuggled up the mountain in pieces over several trips. The nearby stream now flowed through a concealed pipe system, providing running water that passed through a series of natural filters before becoming available for drinking, cooking, and the small shower they had constructed in what had once been the aircraft lavatory. Every inch of interior space served multiple purposes, with seating that converted to storage, walls lined with insulating materials harvested from the mountainside, and windows that could be completely obscured within seconds if Scout's early warning system detected approaching strangers. Most ingenious was the heating system that captured and redistributed warmth from their small cookstove through channels beneath the floor, maintaining comfortable temperatures without producing visible smoke, thanks to a filtration chamber of Henry's design that cooled emissions before releasing them through multiple small vents disguised as natural mountainside features. Mason had created touches of beauty throughout their functional space, incorporating smooth river stones as decorative elements, arranging dried wildflowers in containers fashioned from aircraft parts, and using salvaged fabric to soften the utilitarian interior. Scout enjoyed a dedicated sleeping area near the main entrance, positioned to alert them to any approach while still allowing the dog comfortable integration into their living space. His water bowl cleverly connected to the main filtration system for constant fresh supply. The kitchen area, constructed from repurposed instrument panels and storage compartments, featured a surface for food preparation, storage for their harvested and dried provisions, and even crude refrigeration utilizing the naturally cool mountain stream water circulating through a sealed container. A collection of books salvaged from Henry's cabin and the aircraft itself filled a small shelf beside Mason's sleeping area, providing education and escape in equal measure. Standing together in the center of their completed sanctuary, as afternoon light filtered through camouflaged windows, casting dappled patterns across the floor that mimicked the forest outside, Mason felt something he had not experienced since his father's disappearance: the profound security of having a true home. The aircraft that had fallen from the sky as broken wreckage had risen again as a hidden paradise, its transformation mirroring Mason's own journey from abandoned child to purposeful young man with allies and agency. While corporate searchers trampled the mountainside below with destructive determination, this secret sanctuary represented everything they sought to protect: the perfect symbolic fusion of human ingenuity and natural harmony that stood in direct opposition to Apex's exploitative relationship with the mountain environment. Scout circled their living space with evident approval, his tail wagging as he investigated each corner before settling contentedly by the main entrance, the dog's relaxed posture confirming what Mason already felt: that despite the dangers surrounding them, they had created something worth defending with all their combined resources and resolve. The moment of truth arrived on a storm-filled evening, lightning illuminating the mountain peaks in stark flashes as Mason finally removed the key Henry had entrusted to him, the small metal object heavy with significance beyond its physical weight. Scout watched attentively from his guard position as Mason's small fingers inserted the key into the sophisticated lock of the metal case that had remained unopened since its discovery, the mechanism yielding with surprising smoothness to reveal contents meticulously organized despite the violence of the crash that had brought them to Eagle Peak. Henry stood silently nearby, respecting the profoundly personal nature of this moment, as Mason carefully lifted the protective covering to expose layer upon layer of damning evidence. Water and soil sample analyses showing toxic contamination levels hundreds of times above legal limits. Internal company memos explicitly acknowledging the environmental damage while calculating that settlements for resulting illnesses would cost less than proper remediation. Photographs documenting midnight dumping operations in protected watersheds, and medical records from downstream communities revealing clusters of rare cancers and neurological disorders in children, corresponding precisely with the timeline of Apex's expanded operations. Maps detailed the contamination spread through interconnected water systems, affecting towns and villages whose residents remained unaware that their unexplained illnesses originated with corporate decisions made in boardrooms hundreds of miles away, where human suffering registered only as potential liability figures on quarterly reports. Beneath these official documents lay something far more personal, a sealed envelope addressed simply to "my son," in handwriting that made Mason's heart constrict with recognition before he had even broken the seal. The letter inside, written on the evening before his father's disappearance, spoke directly to the abandoned child Mason had been and the determined young man he was becoming. "Mason, if you're reading this, then you've discovered truths I hoped to shield you from until you were older, stronger, ready to understand why I made the most painful decision any father could face. Apex threatened you directly, showing me surveillance photos of you sleeping, playing, vulnerable moments that made their message unmistakable. Their operatives made it clear that if I continued building this case against them, you would suffer an unfortunate accident that no investigation would ever link back to them. By disappearing with what they believe is all existing evidence, I've drawn their resources and attention away from you. giving you the chance to grow up safely while I attempt to establish secure federal protection for both of us. Every day away from you has been torment, knowing you might believe yourself abandoned by the father who loves you more than his own life, more than his mission, more than anything in this world. I pray that someday you'll understand my choice was made not to leave you, but to preserve you, to ensure that the bright, brave boy I love would have the chance to become the extraordinary man I know you'll grow into. The documentation in this case represents truth powerful enough to bring justice to communities suffering silently, to honor colleagues who gave their lives pursuing this evidence, and perhaps to reunite a father with the son who remains his reason for continuing this fight despite impossible odds. Tears streamed unchecked down Mason's face as pieces of his fractured life finally aligned into a coherent whole, the lonely years of perceived abandonment, transformed by understanding of his father's desperate sacrifice, Scout pressing against him in silent support as the storm outside echoed the emotional tempest within. Dawn painted the sanctuary with golden light as Mason spread the evidence across their small table, the weight of possibility and danger hanging heavy in the aircraft cabin while Scout maintained vigilant watch at the entrance. Henry had fallen silent after reviewing the complete contents of the metal case, his weathered face reflecting calculations and consequences beyond Mason's experience, as the mountain man finally spoke with measured gravity. This evidence would bring Apex to justice, possibly lead to finding your father if he's still alive, but coming forward means sacrificing everything we've built here and placing yourself directly in their crosshairs. Once they know a 12-year-old boy possesses what their entire security apparatus has been hunting, they will deploy resources beyond anything you've witnessed thus far. This sanctuary would be compromised, your anonymity destroyed, and while federal authorities might eventually provide protection, corporations like Apex operate in gray areas where official safeguards often fail against determined private contractors with unlimited funding. Mason traced his fingers over his father's signature on the letter, feeling the indentation of pen on paper as if reaching across the years to connect with the man who had sacrificed everything to protect him, his young mind grappling with implications that would challenge even experienced adults. The mountain sanctuary represented security, control, and the independent life he had carved from abandonment, its hidden beauty reflecting his resilience and adaptation to circumstances that would have broken many grown men. Yet the documentation before him contained truth powerful enough to prevent thousands of other children from suffering illnesses caused by corporate decisions made in distant boardrooms, potentially save communities currently drinking contaminated water without knowledge of its source, and perhaps most personally significant, create circumstances where father and son might reunite if the missing environmental investigator still lived. Sometimes safety becomes its own prison, Mason said quietly, Scout padding over to rest his head on the boy's knee as if sensing the momentous nature of the decision before them. My father didn't disappear to protect just me, but to preserve the chance that this evidence might someday reach people who could use it properly. If I hide here forever, I honor his sacrifice but abandon his mission, the very purpose that forced our separation. Henry nodded slowly, understanding etched in the deep lines of his face as he studied the boy who had survived 3 years of abandonment, only to face an even more difficult challenge now that he understood its true nature. If we move forward, everything changes permanently. There's no returning to this life once Apex knows who you are and what you possess. The authorities who receive this evidence might protect you physically but will place you in systems and structures where your freedom would be severely restricted. This sanctuary would be lost, possibly destroyed in their search efforts, and the mountain life you've built would end completely. Sunlight illuminated the photograph of Mason's father standing beside the aircraft that had become their home, the parallel not lost on either of them, as Henry continued with gentle frankness. Your father faced this same decision, weighing his mission against your safety, ultimately choosing your protection over all else. Now you face the reverse, weighing justice and potential reunion against the certain loss of this sanctuary and the peaceful existence we've established here. Whatever you decide, I'll stand with you, but understand fully what we risk before committing to a path we cannot later abandon. The sanctuary's illusion of perfect security shattered at midday, when Scout's warning growl alerted Mason seconds before the perimeter alarm triggered, indicating movement through their early warning system on the eastern approach to the crash site. Peering through a concealed observation port, Mason's blood froze at the sight of 3 Apex security personnel in tactical gear examining fresh footprints that recent rain had failed to completely erase. their handheld devices sweeping methodically across the area where Mason had harvested berries the previous morning. One man knelt to examine a broken branch while another photographed what appeared to be Scout's paw print preserved in soft mud, the third speaking urgently into a communication device that would inevitably summon reinforcements to this promising discovery. With practiced efficiency born from Henry's relentless preparation drills, Mason gathered only essential survival items and the most critical evidence documents, securing them in the waterproof pack they kept ready for precisely this emergency. Scout standing ready by the concealed rear exit that led directly into dense underbrush. Henry had departed hours earlier to monitor Apex movements from his observation post, leaving Mason to implement their contingency plan alone as the security team advanced steadily toward the hidden aircraft. Their trained movements, suggesting they sensed proximity to their objective despite the sophisticated camouflage concealing it from direct view. With Scout leading the way through routes they had rehearsed repeatedly, Mason slipped from the sanctuary into the wilderness beyond. Each step physically painful as he abandoned the paradise they had created with such care, the comfortable home transformed from wreckage, the safe haven that represented months of ingenious adaptation. The boy and his dog maintained absolute silence as they navigated the treacherous descent to the cave system Henry had designated as their emergency rendezvous point. Scout's keen senses alert for human scents or sounds that might indicate pursuit as they used every concealment technique the mountain man had taught them. Reaching the cave entrance as afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountainside, Mason's heart constricted at the sound of distant voices carried on shifting winds, confirming his sanctuary's discovery, as Apex personnel swarmed the area like disturbed hornets, their radios crackling with excited communications about clear evidence of recent habitation and potential recovery of critical materials. From the concealed vantage point Henry had established near the cave entrance, Mason could see the corporate forces converging on his beloved aircraft home, their movements precise and predatory as they began methodically dismantling the camouflage that had protected it for months. Their expressions visible through binoculars shifting from professional detachment to dawning excitement as they recognized the crashed plane beneath its disguise. Clutching the waterproof pack containing his father's letter and the most damning evidence against Apex, Mason battled tears that threatened to overwhelm his hard-won composure. The sanctuary's violation feeling intensely personal as strangers invaded the space where he had finally begun healing from abandonment, where security and beauty had merged into something approaching happiness despite the circumstances that had created it. Scout pressed against his side, offering silent comfort as darkness gradually concealed the corporate invaders still swarming their mountain paradise. The sanctuary compromised but not yet fully surrendered, as Mason whispered promises to the loyal dog that they would reclaim their home when circumstances allowed, the aircraft paradise representing not just shelter but the symbolic fusion of tragedy transformed into triumph that defined his entire existence since his father's disappearance. Dawn broke with the ominous thrum of helicopter rotors echoing between mountain peaks, forcing Mason deeper into the sheltering forest, as Apex deployed aerial search capabilities that transformed their pursuit from concerning to potentially lethal. Rains that would have once been an unwelcome discomfort now became tactical advantage, as Mason implemented his father's teachings about tracking and counter-tracking, leading Scout through flowing streams that left no scent or footprints, carefully backtracking and creating false trails that would waste corporate resources, and utilizing naturally occurring terrain features that rendered them invisible from above, despite the sophisticated thermal imaging equipment he had observed during his surveillance of the Apex base camp. The evidence pack never left his body, secured beneath his clothing where its precious contents remained protected from the elements that alternately threatened and shielded them, its weight a constant reminder of purpose amid exhaustion. Scout proved invaluable beyond measure, the German Shepherd's acute senses providing early warning of approaching search teams long before Mason could detect them, allowing strategic withdrawals rather than panicked flight that would inevitably create telltale signs for trained trackers to follow. 3 days into their desperate evasion, Mason found himself navigating a treacherous ridgeline during torrential rainfall, the water simultaneously concealing their passage and creating deadly hazards as saturated soil gave way beneath uncertain footing. Scout whining softly with concern as the boy's smaller frame struggled against punishing conditions that tested the limits of his endurance. Henry's lessons in natural camouflage became life-preserving skills as Mason covered himself and Scout with mud that masked their heat signatures from aerial thermal detection, gathered specific plants that disrupted tracking dogs' ability to maintain scent trails, and created shelters so perfectly integrated into the landscape that searchers passed within yards without detecting their presence. When a security team separated Mason from his planned escape route, the boy implemented his father's contingency training, creating a diversion using carefully arranged stones that collapsed with convincing human-like sounds when triggered by nearly invisible fishing line, drawing pursuers away from his actual position and buying precious time to reach higher, more defensible terrain. Sleep came in brief, vigilant intervals, with Scout maintaining protective watch while Mason recovered enough strength to continue their journey toward the distant emergency rendezvous point Henry had established months earlier. Their progress measured in painful yards rather than miles, as corporate resources saturated the mountain with increasingly desperate hunters. Hunger became a constant companion as Mason rationed their limited provisions, supplementing with foraged plants his father had taught him to identify years earlier. The skills that had once been interesting wilderness lessons, transforming into survival necessities against adversaries who viewed a child as merely an obstacle to corporate interests worth billions. Most challenging was the psychological weight of isolation. With no certainty of Henry's safety or current position, no guarantee that their emergency protocols remained viable, as Apex committed seemingly limitless resources to recovering evidence that would destroy them, and no assurance that Mason's decision to preserve the documentation, rather than ensuring his own security, had been the correct moral choice. Yet with each successful evasion, each clever adaptation to changing pursuit patterns, Mason felt his father's approving presence alongside him. Scout's unwavering loyalty reinforcing his determination as boy and dog pushed beyond normal human endurance toward a destination that represented not just physical safety but vindication of sacrifices spanning years of separation and suffering. The temporary shelter beneath a massive fallen sequoia provided Mason his first opportunity to thoroughly examine his father's journal since fleeing their compromised sanctuary, Scout maintaining vigilant watch at both ends of their natural fortress as rain discouraged aerial pursuit. Turning to the journal's final pages with trembling hands, Mason noticed almost imperceptible indentations beneath certain letters, a communication method his father had taught him years earlier for leaving messages that casual observation would never detect. Pressing the page at a shallow angle against filtered sunlight revealed a carefully constructed alphanumeric code, utilizing the first letter of every third sentence across multiple entries, a pattern recognizable only to someone intimately familiar with family cipher systems established during happier times when codes represented adventure rather than survival necessity. Working methodically, despite physical exhaustion and hunger, Mason translated the hidden message with growing urgency as fragments assembled into devastating clarity. Captured not killed Apex holding facility coordinates follow. The revelation that his father lived sent electric shock through Mason's exhausted body. Scout responding instantly to his quickened breathing by pressing closer, offering stability as the boy's world transformed yet again with information that rewrote 3 years of assumed history. Additional decoded segments revealed how Apex security forces had intercepted his father before he could reach federal prosecutors, staging an apparent deadly accident while secretly transporting him to a private detention facility located within the vast corporate mining complex 50 miles north, where he remained imprisoned. His environmental expertise forcibly redirected toward helping Apex conceal evidence of their crimes rather than expose them. The final coded section detailed how his father had maintained hope through captivity, by focusing on eventual reunion with the son whose safety he had purchased through apparent abandonment, believing his sacrifice meaningful only if Mason remained free from corporate reach. Reading between carefully constructed lines, Mason recognized his father's implicit message that the documentation now secured against Mason's chest represented the only remaining evidence that could bring justice to communities suffering from contaminated water, vindication to colleagues who had died pursuing truth, and freedom to a father who had sacrificed everything to protect his son from powerful forces that viewed human lives as acceptable collateral damage to profit margins. Scout's low growl alerted Mason seconds before distant voices carried on shifting winds, prompting immediate action as boy and dog slipped from their temporary shelter into the concealing forest beyond, their movements now driven not just by survival instinct but by renewed purpose that transformed mere escape into mission, retreat into advance toward a different objective than originally planned. The realization that his father endured imprisonment rather than death changed everything about Mason's understanding of their circumstances, converting what had been a defensive struggle to preserve evidence into potential offensive action to secure not just justice but family reunion. The coordinates carefully memorized from the journal offering concrete destination rather than abstract concepts of eventual safety. As night fell across the mountain range that had simultaneously sheltered and threatened them, Mason whispered new promises to Scout, explaining their shifted objectives with quiet determination that assumed the loyal dog understood every word, their shared bond transcending normal human-animal relationships through trials that had tested them both beyond reasonable limits, the evidence pack now representing not just corporate accountability but literal key to his father's freedom from captivity that had spanned Mason's transition from carefree child to hardened survivor. The winding path back to the original cabin felt both foreign and familiar after months away, Mason navigating by memory and instinct while Scout ranged ahead, ensuring their approach remained undetected by any corporate sentries who might monitor the supposedly abandoned structure. Autumn leaves carpeted the forest floor, muffling their footsteps as they emerged into the small clearing where Mason had spent 3 lonely years believing himself forgotten. The cabin's weathered exterior showing signs of neglect, yet standing remarkably intact against mountain elements that could have reclaimed it completely. Entering cautiously through the rear window rather than more obvious front door, Mason found the interior exactly as they had left it months earlier, dust covering the sparse furnishings that had defined his solitary existence before the aircraft crash had transformed both his physical circumstances and understanding of his father's disappearance. Scout maintained guard position by the window as Mason methodically searched for additional supplies they would need for the next phase of their journey, gathering preserved food, ammunition for the hunting rifle, and cold weather gear, essential for survival as autumn surrendered to approaching winter. While removing his spare clothing from beneath the bed that had once been his father's, Mason noticed a subtle irregularity in the floorboards, his trained fingers detecting almost imperceptible seams that ordinary inspection would never reveal. Prying carefully with his hunting knife revealed a sophisticated hidden compartment built into the cabin foundation itself, containing a waterproof metal box that opened with the same key that had unlocked the aircraft case. Suggesting deliberate connection between these separate caches his father had prepared with remarkable foresight. Inside lay items of extraordinary value to their current circumstances, a sealed package containing multiple authenticated copies of the environmental evidence. Ensuring destruction of one set would not compromise the entire case against Apex. Emergency funds in the form of cash and untraceable gold coins, sufficient to finance extended travel or secure necessary resources, without creating electronic trails the corporation might monitor. Forged identification documents for both Mason and his father with associated backstories, detailed enough to withstand casual scrutiny, and most critically, a notebook containing contact information for trusted allies across multiple agencies and organizations, each name accompanied by verification protocols and secure communication methods that would help distinguish genuine assistance from potential corporate infiltration. Beneath these practical resources lay something that struck Mason's heart with painful recognition, a small wooden box containing photographs of himself at various ages, from infant to just before his father's disappearance, along with a hand-carved German Shepherd figure that perfectly captured Scout's alert expression. Evidence his father had continued creating memories and connections, even while preparing for worst-case scenarios that might separate them indefinitely. Mason traced the wooden figure with trembling fingers, noting the precise attention to Scout's distinctive markings and the slight tilt of his head that appeared whenever the dog sensed something important. The craftsmanship revealing hours of patient work by hands that had known exactly what they were commemorating. A folded piece of paper tucked beneath the figurine contained a pencil sketch of Mason sleeping beside Scout in their cabin bed, dated just weeks before his father's disappearance. The careful shading capturing peaceful vulnerability his father had obviously sat watching long enough to document with tender precision. The discovery transformed Mason's understanding yet again, revealing that the cabin he had viewed as symbol of abandonment had actually contained protection and preparation for eventual reunion all along. The structure itself representing not desertion but his father's determined efforts to create safety nets that might someday enable justice without sacrificing his son's security. Tears he had suppressed during months of hiding and survival now flowed freely as Mason gathered these treasures to his chest, each item representing not just practical planning but profound emotional connection maintained through years of forced separation. The mountain cabin, once representing isolation and abandonment, suddenly transformed in Mason's perception to something closer to sacred ground, where his father had labored in secret to preserve both their physical safety and emotional bond, despite overwhelming corporate power arrayed against. Scout whined softly, pressing against Mason's side as if understanding the emotional significance of these discoveries, the loyal dog embodying continuous connection to a father whose presence suddenly felt immediate despite years of physical absence. The hidden compartment revealing preparations so thorough it could only have been created by someone whose love transcended immediate circumstances to anticipate future needs with extraordinary precision and care. As Mason carefully repacked the essential items into his weatherproof bag, Scout's sudden alertness warned that their window of safety might be closing. But the boy moved with renewed purpose, now fueled by tangible proof that their reunion might not just be possible but had been meticulously prepared for by a father whose love had never actually abandoned him. The narrow cave Henry had designated as their command center buzzed with purposeful energy as Mason meticulously arranged the evidence across stone surfaces, while simultaneously outlining his strategy to the mountain man who had returned, with critical intelligence about Apex's search patterns and communication protocols. Utilizing skills that transformed from survival necessity to tactical advantage, Mason developed an elaborate deception leveraging his intimate knowledge of the mountain's hidden pathways, seasonal water patterns, and natural choke points that corporate forces with satellite imagery but limited ground experience would inevitably misinterpret. They're following predictable search grids, Mason explained, Scout attentively watching his master unfold detailed maps where marked X's indicated locations they had prepared with misleading evidence trails. We'll plant torn pages from duplicated documents near the western ravine, leading them to believe we're attempting escape toward county roads, while simultaneously creating unmistakable signs of human passage heading north toward the state border. Henry nodded approval as he prepared the secure satellite communication device he had smuggled through Apex's expanding perimeter. Their plan requiring precise timing between Mason's elaborate distraction and Henry's transmission of authenticated evidence packages to multiple federal agencies simultaneously, preventing corporate influence from blocking any single channel. Scout's training proved invaluable as Mason attached specialized scent markers to the dog's collar that would temporarily mislead Apex's tracking animals, creating false confirmation of the deceptive trails they had meticulously established across 3 separate mountain zones. The loyal shepherd had undergone intensive training sessions with Henry over the past weeks, learning to follow complex command patterns and deposit evidence at precise coordinates without human accompaniment, his natural intelligence enhanced by focused exercises that transformed him from mere companion to critical operative in their dangerous mission. Most ingenious was Mason's utilization of weather patterns only mountain residents would anticipate, timing their operation to coincide with approaching storm systems that would temporarily disable aerial surveillance while amplifying the effectiveness of ground distractions they had positioned. He had meticulously calculated barometric pressure changes that would intensify scent trails in specific valleys while dispersing others, creating a sensory labyrinth that would confuse even the most experienced trackers and their specialized equipment. The cave walls themselves had become tactical assets, the limestone surfaces preserving years of Mason's careful notations about seasonal water flows, wildlife migration patterns, and geological features that could either conceal or reveal human presence depending on how they were navigated. The satellite imagery Henry had obtained from his surveillance revealed the full extent of Apex's commitment, with nearly 50 personnel now combing the mountain and sophisticated signal interception equipment established at their base camp, confirming the corporation's desperation to recover evidence that threatened their existence. Mason studied these photographs with the focused intensity that 3 years of isolation had cultivated, identifying vulnerable gaps in their coverage where corporate arrogance had substituted technological solutions for genuine wilderness knowledge, creating exploitable weaknesses that would prove decisive in the coming hours. Mason's hands trembled slightly as he packed the genuine evidence dockets into specialized containers Henry would transport through nearly invisible game trails to the secure transmission site. The boy's determination tempered by understanding of consequences should their carefully orchestrated plan fail. Each document represented not just corporate crimes but potential freedom for his imprisoned father, transforming ordinary paper into vessels of potential liberation or further endangerment depending on their success or failure. "Once we transmit, there's no retreat," Henry warned, checking equipment with methodical precision. "Federal response will take at minimum 18 hours, during which Apex will commit everything to discovering the transmission source and recovering whatever evidence remains." His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, testing battery connections and verifying encryption protocols, while simultaneously monitoring storm progression through a handcrafted barometer whose precision exceeded standard meteorological equipment. Mason's response reflected the transformation from abandoned child to strategic adversary that circumstances had forced upon him. They believe they're hunting a frightened boy, but they're actually facing someone who has survived alone on this mountain for 3 years, who knows every cave and crevice, every false trail and hidden approach, and who now fights not just for himself but for his father's freedom and justice for every family their poisons have harmed. The quiet confidence in his voice contrasted sharply with his small physical frame, the disparity between apparent vulnerability and actual capability representing their greatest tactical advantage against corporate forces that would inevitably underestimate him based on age alone. As night fell across the mountain range, they had converted from territory to battleground. Mason watched Scout disappear into darkness on the first phase of their mission, the loyal dog's specialized training allowing him to deposit misleading evidence at precisely mapped locations while Mason and Henry prepared the genuine documentation for transmission, their elaborate trap dependent on corporate arrogance that would inevitably underestimate a child's capacity for strategic deception while overestimating their own technological advantages against adversaries who had transformed the mountain itself into both weapon and shield in their asymmetrical confrontation. The plane sanctuary's interior looked jarringly different as Mason entered through the concealed rear access, corporate intrusion evident in disrupted furnishings and carelessly dismantled features that had once represented painstaking craftsmanship. Yet the space retained enough of its transformed beauty to remind him powerfully of what they had created from destruction. Mason had deliberately returned as final phase of their elaborate plan, knowing Apex would eventually realize they had been pursuing false trails across multiple sectors, while the genuine target had circled back to the most obvious location, a psychological gambit that proved successful as the cabin door swung open to reveal Charles Whitfield, Apex's head of security, flanked by 2 armed operatives whose expressions registered momentary shock at finding a small boy calmly seated in the aircraft's pilot chair. "You've caused considerable inconvenience for a child playing at survival," Whitfield stated with clinical detachment, his tailored suit incongruous against the mountain setting, his manicured hand resting casually on a holstered sidearm as his eyes catalogued Mason with professional assessment. "The evidence you believe so valuable was scheduled for destruction 3 years ago. Your father's unfortunate interference merely delayed inevitable corporate expansion that will bring prosperity to these economically depressed regions." Mason maintained deliberate calm despite thundering heartbeats. Scout positioned strategically between them as planned, the German Shepherd's seemingly relaxed posture concealing combat training Henry had revealed during their preparations. Prosperity built on poisoned water and children dying from rare cancers in downstream communities, Mason replied, his voice steadier than seemed possible given his age and the circumstances. "My father documented everything, from your illegal mining operations to your systematic intimidation of officials, all transmitted 93 minutes ago to the Environmental Crimes Division, FBI headquarters, and 3 separate environmental protection organizations whose servers contain dead man switches that will automatically publish everything if contact isn't maintained." Whitfield's composed demeanor fractured momentarily, his eyes darting to his communication device, which confirmed the satellite transmission spike his team had detected but dismissed as atmospheric interference rather than actual data transfer. "You're bluffing," he stated with diminishing confidence, advancing 2 deliberate steps as his subordinates spread to flanking positions. A child couldn't possibly navigate federal reporting protocols or secure authenticated transmission channels. Mason allowed himself a small smile, channeling years of isolation and recent months of strategic preparation into the perfect response. "I'm not just any child. I'm the son of the man you've imprisoned for 3 years, taught to survive alone on this mountain, mentored by his partner, and entrusted with evidence that will dismantle your entire operation and free my father from your corporate black site." The calculated revelation of specific knowledge regarding his father's imprisonment shattered Whitfield's professional control, his hand moving toward his weapon with deadly intent that triggered Scout's instantaneous response, the German Shepherd launching into protective action with precision that belied his civilian appearance. Powerful jaws clamping around Whitfield's wrist with carefully controlled pressure that immobilized without maiming, while Mason calmly raised his father's hunting rifle that had been positioned strategically behind the 5 pilot's chair. Federal agents are already moving toward your detention facility based on coordinates we provided, Mason stated with extraordinary composure for a 12-year-old facing armed adversaries. Your corporate protection ends today, Mr. Whitfield, not through violence but through truth finally reaching those with authority to act on it. The aircraft cabin pulsed with dangerous potential as Scout maintained his grip on Whitfield's immobilized wrist, the executive's face contorted with pain and fury, while his subordinates froze in the standoff created by Mason's unexpected resistance. Their weapons half drawn but held in check by the boy's steady rifle, and the German shepherd's demonstrated willingness to protect his young master. In that suspended moment, Mason felt power flood his small frame, the accumulated weight of 3 years of abandonment, months of pursuit, and the recent knowledge of his father's imprisonment, creating an almost overwhelming urge toward retribution against the man who represented everything that had stolen his childhood and family. Whitfield must have recognized the darkness flickering across Mason's expression, must have seen the trembling finger on the rifle's trigger, because genuine fear replaced his professional detachment as he whispered, "He's just a child, he won't actually." But his words died as Mason stepped forward, Scout maintaining perfect position between them, and spoke with a maturity that transcended his 12 years. "I could hurt you now the way you've hurt my family and countless others, but that would make me what you are, someone who values power above humanity." With deliberate control that Henry had taught him during long nights discussing justice versus vengeance, Mason lowered the rifle slightly, continuing with steady determination. "My father risked everything to expose your crimes through legal channels rather than seeking personal revenge. And I honor his example by choosing the same path despite having every reason to choose otherwise." The distant sound of approaching helicopters penetrated the tension-filled cabin, followed by authoritative voices through megaphones announcing federal presence on the mountain, the timing confirming the success of their transmission plan, and Henry's ability to coordinate response through his remaining agency connections. Whitfield's expression collapsed into resignation as the cabin filled suddenly with tactical officers in FBI windbreakers, their weapons trained professionally on the Apex personnel, while Scout released his hold on command. Returning to Mason's side with perfect discipline that drew admiring glances from the federal agents, a silver-haired woman in a suit stepped forward, identifying herself as Assistant Director Caroline Hayes of the Environmental Crimes Division, her eyes softening momentarily as she addressed Mason directly. "Your father's colleague Henry advised us we would find both evidence and extraordinary courage at these coordinates. He was correct on both counts." As the agents secured Whitfield and his subordinates, reading rights and documenting the confrontation with meticulous professionalism, Mason felt something unexpected bloom within his chest, not the satisfaction of vengeance fulfilled but something cleaner and more sustaining, a recognition that in choosing mercy when revenge was possible, he had preserved something essential within himself that Apex had failed to destroy despite years of separation and hardship. Scout pressed against his leg, brown eyes reflecting understanding that transcended human language, the loyal companion who had witnessed Mason's journey from abandoned child to young man capable of breaking cycles of violence through conscious choice rather than reactive emotion. As they emerged from the aircraft sanctuary into mountain sunlight now filled with federal vehicles and personnel, Mason realized the most meaningful victory wasn't in Whitfield's defeat, or even in the evidence that would bring corporate accountability, but in his capacity to honor his father's moral example, despite every provocation toward darker alternatives, proving that Apex had failed in their most fundamental objective. They had never succeeded in destroying the essential humanity of either father or son. Federal agents had transported Mason's father directly from the Apex detention facility to Eagle Peak, medical personnel attending to his immediate needs during the journey while Mason and Scout waited at the transformed aircraft sanctuary, the boy's emotions cycling between elation, anxiety, and disbelief that 3 years of separation might finally end. The sanctuary had been partially restored following the federal raid, enough of its unique character preserved that it still represented their remarkable transformation of tragedy into triumph, despite corporate invasion and subsequent law enforcement presence. When the helicopter appeared above the clearing, Mason stood frozen beside Scout, the German shepherd's tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm as if recognizing the approaching scent even before the thin figure emerged unsteadily from the aircraft. Supported by agents yet moving with increasing determination as he caught sight of his son, waiting beside the plane that had become symbolic sanctuary, Mason's paralysis broke suddenly, his small body launching forward as his father fell to his knees, arms outstretched to receive the boy he had sacrificed everything to protect, their embrace conveying 3 years of unspoken words, explanations, and emotions too profound for language, as Scout circled them with joyful barks, eventually pushing his way into their reunion with enthusiastic recognition that drew teary laughter from both father and son. Hours later, as federal personnel established perimeters around the mountain property, now designated as protected crime scene and witness location, Mason sat beside his father inside the aircraft sanctuary, Scout positioned protectively between them, as the older man explained with quiet intensity how Apex's illegal mining operations had contaminated groundwater feeding 3 major river systems, introducing carcinogens and heavy metals into watersheds serving rural communities across 7 states. Their corporate influence, silencing regulatory agencies and intimidating researchers who attempted documenting the devastating health consequences. They approached me first with bribes, his father explained, fingers tracing Scout's fur with reverent appreciation for the companion who had protected his son, then threats against my career, then surveillance photos of you playing at school, sleeping in your bed, vulnerable moments that made their message unmistakable. My silence for your safety. His voice broke, describing the desperate decision to disappear with evidence, hoping to draw corporate attention away from Mason while establishing federal protection, never anticipating the immediate capture that would separate them for 3 long years, during which his only comfort had been believing his son remained safely anonymous on their mountain property. Everything I did, even letting you believe yourself abandoned, served one purpose: keeping you beyond their reach while preserving evidence that could eventually bring justice to families watching their children suffer from illnesses whose source they couldn't identify. Mason leaned against his father's shoulder, physical contact reinforcing emotional reconnection as he described, transforming the crashed plane into sanctuary, meeting Henry, discovering hidden evidence, and ultimately implementing the strategy that had secured both justice and reunion. His father's expression reflecting growing wonder at how his abandoned son had evolved from vulnerable child to resourceful young man whose courage and moral choices had accomplished what teams of trained investigators had failed to achieve against corporate power that had seemed insurmountable. Spring painted the mountainside with wildflowers and renewed purpose as Mason, his father, and Scout watched construction crews reinforcing the aircraft sanctuary's foundation with permanent materials that would preserve its unique character, while transforming it into a sustainable home designed to last generations. The federal prosecution of Apex Mining had concluded with historic settlements exceeding $6 billion, funds directed toward environmental remediation of contaminated watersheds, medical treatment for affected communities, and a substantial trust designated specifically for the establishment of the Eagle Peak Environmental Research Foundation, with Mason and his father serving as its founding directors. The aircraft interior had evolved yet again, now incorporating sophisticated monitoring equipment that analyzed water and soil samples from throughout the mountain range, identifying contamination sources before they could spread to vulnerable communities, their data transmitted to regulatory agencies through protocols that corporate influence could no longer compromise or suppress. Laboratory spaces occupied what had once been cargo areas, their gleaming surfaces and precision instruments representing the transformation of crisis into opportunity, while comfortable living areas preserved the homey touches Mason had created during his months of solitary adaptation, honoring both the scientific mission and the personal journey that had brought them to this unprecedented moment of triumph against seemingly insurmountable corporate power. Scout patrolled their expanded territory with the same vigilance that had protected Mason during his years of isolation, though his duties now included greeting environmental researchers who regularly visited the Foundation headquarters established in Henry's former cabin, the mountain man himself serving as chief security consultant while training a new generation of wilderness protection specialists whose backgrounds often included law enforcement and military experience specifically redirected toward Dia-10 environmental defense rather than corporate interests. The Foundation had already attracted international attention for its innovative approach to ecosystem protection, combining grassroots community involvement with cutting-edge scientific monitoring systems that democratized environmental data previously accessible only to regulatory agencies vulnerable to corporate influence, creating transparency that proved more powerful than legal mandates alone in preventing future Apex scenarios from developing unchallenged. Mason's bedroom within the transformed aircraft featured a wall covered with photographs documenting their journey from separation to reunion, the center image showing father and son standing beside the sanctuary with Scout between them. Tangible proof that even the most devastating abandonment could eventually reveal itself as desperate protection. That destruction could transform into creation. That paradise could emerge from tragedy when purpose overcame circumstance. Smaller satellite facilities had been established throughout vulnerable watersheds, staffed by local residents trained through foundation programs that specifically recruited individuals from communities historically excluded from environmental decision-making processes, creating employment opportunities while simultaneously establishing early warning networks maintained by those with most at stake in preserving water and soil quality. The Foundation's first major initiative focused on developing warning systems for rural communities downriver from potential contamination sources. Technology designed specifically to empower those most vulnerable to corporate environmental crimes, simultaneously honoring Mason's traumatic experience of abandonment by ensuring no other child would suffer similar consequences from powerful interests, prioritizing profit over human welfare. Several former Apex executives, facing prison terms resulting from evidence Mason had preserved, had unexpectedly approached the Foundation, offering testimony against industry practices, their cooperation reducing sentences while providing insider knowledge that proved invaluable in identifying vulnerable regulatory gaps corporations routinely exploited, creating unprecedented collaboration between former adversaries, united by recognition that environmental protection ultimately served universal rather than partisan interests. Where Apex had once envisioned extracting mineral wealth regardless of environmental consequences, the Foundation now hosted wilderness camps for children from affected communities, teaching sustainable interaction with mountain ecosystems while providing medical support for those suffering long-term effects of corporate negligence, transforming exploitation into education and healing through programs that specifically honored indigenous knowledge systems that had protected these mountains for centuries before corporate extraction began. On quiet evenings when researchers departed and monitoring systems maintained their silent vigilance, Mason often sat with his father and Scout on the aircraft's reinforced wing, now converted into an observation deck overlooking the valley they had protected through their combined sacrifice and determination. Their conversations moving seamlessly between scientific analysis and personal reflection, between future environmental protection strategies and careful processing of their traumatic separation, their relationship evolving from fractured past toward integrated future, built on shared purpose rather than lingering resentment. The sanctuary that had begun as desperate shelter for an abandoned boy had transformed into symbol of resilience, innovation, and environmental stewardship, its distinctive silhouette, visible from certain valley approaches as reminder that destruction could become foundation for paradise when human determination aligned with natural harmony. That corporate power ultimately proved less enduring than a child's love for mountain wilderness and loyal dog, and that true security emerged not from isolation but from purposeful connection to causes larger than individual survival. Mason's journey from abandoned child to environmental protector, representing healing not just for one family but for an entire mountain ecosystem once threatened by the very corporate greed that had inadvertently created its most determined defenders.